So good to be in God's house with you today. And wow, that microphone's a bit hot, so I'll let you sort out as I continue talking. But I want to just ask you a quick question. Before I get into the word, I want you to think about what is the thing that brings the most panic into your life? What brings you the most panic into your life? When I think about my youngest son, one of the things that he doesn't enjoy is going to bed at night with the door closed. He likes to have a crack of the door open and keep it just a crack open so light can come through, because he's not like afraid of the dark, but this is like his comfort thing. And so we're trying to work it through. And I was like, look, if I don't close the door, the cat's going to come into your room during the night to bug you, which he does. He'll go and like lay right beside his head. And I'm like, you know what? We love the cat, but I'd rather you get a perfect good night's sleep. But anyways, it's one of those things that's difficult. What about if all of a sudden you were not able to put food on the table? If all of a sudden you were not able to put food on the table, your resources dried up, and your kids are hungry, you are hungry, and you don't know where to get food. That's one of the challenges Debbie and I faced when we went on some trips before, where we fly out. And I remember we were going to my brother's wedding in South Africa back in 2009, and we stopped in Amsterdam on the way back, and we stayed a few days there, and our two daughters were very young. Sophia, our oldest, was about 2 years old, and Layla was just a few months old. And we're walking through the streets of Amsterdam, and we're like, what are we going to eat? So we asked them, hey, can you tell us where we can find a coffee shop? You can get some coffee, maybe some sandwiches. And the guy looked at me, he's like, you mean a cafe? I was like, no, yeah, coffee shop, cafe, same difference. Like, not the same thing here, my friend. Cafe is where you get coffee and sandwiches and whatever. Coffee shop is where you get weed. And I was like, yeah, no, the cafe, please. But then we were going through this little market area, and our oldest daughter was getting cranky. She needed sleep. And that sense of desperation came over Debbie and I, of like she was really getting cranky, and it was becoming unruly. And so as we're walking by, Debbie's like, you know what, let's just get her a lollipop really quickly. And so she just goes into this little, to this table and picks out a lollipop to give to Sophia. And I'm like, whoa, wait a second. And I looked at her, like, this is a hash pop. Do you know what this is? I mean, it will solve the problem, but create another one. She didn't know. There's a lot of things about Amsterdam my wife didn't know. I love her innocence. When she was planning the trip, it's like, oh, look, Marco, there's a red light district. We should go check it out. I was like, Debbie, do you know what that is? It's like, no, but it's really popular in Amsterdam. I was like, for a reason. When I told her about it, she's like, oh, no, we're not going there. It's like, yeah, I kind of figured. See, that put me in a state of panic at first, because I'm like, oh, man, this is going to be trouble. So, but there's moments that we get into a panic because our needs all of a sudden get tampered with. All of us love to have our needs met. And when our needs don't get met, we complain, we grumble. And that we can actually find that in the Old Testament, when God rescued the people of Israel in such a miraculous and powerful way out of Egypt. And he's taking them through the desert to take them to the promised land. And God's using Moses to lead the way. And as they're going through the desert, they rebel against God. They begin to worship the idols from Egypt. And God really gets ticked off at this. And he's just like, no, now they're going to be staying in the desert for 40 years. And they're not going to go into the promised land. They're just going to go around in circles around this mountain. And imagine being Moses, and you got to deal with this. You got to deal with the fact that there's a consequence now to their sin. There's a consequence to their rebellion. And then on top of it all, they are grumbling about it. The people of Israel are complaining constantly. So what happens? When God's leading them, by day, there's a pillar of cloud leading them. By night, it's a pillar of fire leading them. They would only go where the glory of God would go. And when did they know it was time to stop? It's when the glory of God would stay in the same place. At that moment, they would establish the tent of meeting, they would set up camp, and they would dwell there until the glory of God moved. So important that when you move along in your life, that you're following God and not just whatever rhythm you want. But if God really leads your life, you follow God. And you only go when God says go, right? But during this journey, people got hungry. They ran out of food. So they begin to grumble to Moses. And what does God say to Moses? I am going to send manna, meaning I'm going to send bread from heaven. And every day they are to pick up what they need for the day. Not for the next day because it's going to spoil, it's going to go bad. Only for the day. Each day I will give you your daily bread. This is where we get, in the Lord's Prayer when he's teaching his disciples how to pray. And in Matthew chapter 6, he mentions, give us this day our daily bread. It's a reference to this. But it's like God meeting all of your needs daily as you need them. And it's interesting, we find in there's the greed of people coming out in the open. They take the bread that they need. Oh, this is so good. Bread from heaven. It's better than a French bakery, right? It's not croissants, but you have what you need. And they would take more than what they needed, and then it would spoil for the next day. And this was something that Moses had to address as well. But it's interesting that wherever they needed to go, God was going to lead them. This pillar of fire by night, even in your darkest hour, God's there with you. So if you're afraid of the dark, know this, the people of Israel, even in the darkest of the night, they would see the pillar of fire leading them. When they were in need of bread or food, God provided. And it's interesting because this is the same God that told Moses, when Moses said, when I go to the people of Israel in Egypt and tell them that you've sent me, and they ask me, what is his name? What am I to say? And God said, I am what I am. Now, if you've been with us in the last few weeks as we're going through the series titled, What's in a Name? I've been talking to you about Jesus and certain claims he made about himself. And one of the greatest ones was when he told the Pharisees and the Jewish people, he said, before Abraham was, I am. Meaning Jesus is the great I am. When you read the story of Jesus walking on the water, and the disciples are in the boat, and they're in the middle of a storm, and they see Jesus walking, and they freak out. It's like, Jesus, what is this? Who is that you? And he's like, it's me. But he doesn't just say, it's me. He says, don't be afraid, I am Elohim, who made the heavens and the earth and everything in it. The one who can calm the storm, the great I am, Jesus. It's very clear now in your English translation, when you look at it, it might just say, it is I, but the better translation actually says, I am. No one talks like that, right? But Jesus talked like that because he was trying to get a point across. Now, let me just pull up my notes over here. I want to read with you this passage in John chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. John chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. Because as John writes his gospel, and we've been going through these different I am statements that Jesus makes in the Gospel of John, I want you to understand something that John starts off with and then he ends off with in his gospel. I showed you last week how at the very end of the Gospel of John, he says this, I wrote you this so that you would believe that Jesus is the Son of God. This is his purpose. And the whole letter that he's written is to compel you to put your faith in Jesus. But there's something important you need to know. He says this in chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. In the beginning was the Word, meaning Jesus. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Now, I'm going to take you through two passages today that are going to talk about two different statements that Jesus makes about himself. I'm going to double down today and talk about two particular things that he said about himself. One of them, that he made this claim that he is the bread of life, and the other claim that he says, I am the light of the world. Now, I'm going to explain some things to you, but fundamentally, I want you to know this. Jesus satisfies and guides. Because he is the great I am, Jesus satisfies your needs and guides your life to where he is taking you or wants to take you. This is who he is. You might say to someone, "Who are you to tell me what to do?" Well, when you come to meet Jesus and you discover that he is the great I am, he does not exist for the sake of you telling him what to do and him what to bless, but rather him calling you to join him and follow him, and he will meet all of your needs and he will light the way. The Jesus that oftentimes we would prefer is the Jesus that will be like a vending machine. We put in our coin or coins or your card, and we expect something in return. And oftentimes we go about our life with Jesus saying, "Jesus, would you bless this? I want to do this, Lord. Would you bless this?" And it's not necessarily a wrong thing, but if your heart is only wanting Jesus, when people say, "Yeah, Jesus became a part of my life," can I just say that's probably a distorted view, let's say. Because never once is Jesus saying in the Gospels that he just wants to be part of your life. If anything, he says, "Come follow me," meaning he wants you to be part of his life. If you're going to follow Jesus, he requires, not asks, requires your full allegiance. When we say, "All hail King Jesus," what we are saying is that you rule in the universe and you rule in my life. My wants get thrown to the cross and get crucified to the cross so that I no longer live, but Christ now lives in me. And the life I live in this body, I live by faith in the one who loved me and gave himself for me. That is the path of discipleship. That is the path of following Jesus, the great I am. Anything short of that, and you will not grasp the majesty of Jesus when he makes these claims of being the great I am. So fundamentally, you need to know this, that Jesus is the only one that can satisfy your deepest needs in your soul. The needs that you have in your life, spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally, Jesus can satisfy every single need. And he's also the one who can guide you to the promised land. What is the promised land? The promised land today in Christ would represent this: all that God has for you in Jesus. An incredible destiny, a life full of purpose, a life full of meaning. Jesus is the only one that can give you that. You can search it in all these other things. You can search it in advancement of your career. You can search it in spending more quality time with your family and blowing a ton of money, going to all these different places in the world just so that you can say, "Look what I've done and given to my family." None of that satisfies the spiritual need that only Christ can satisfy. None of that will take you closer to where God actually wants you. It's not bad, but those things are not the great I am. So let me take you to chapter 6 and tell you a little bit about what was going on there. Jesus had just finished feeding 5,000 people. 5,000 people were gathered there to listen to Jesus teach on the mountainside, and they started going hungry. The need began to arise. And so what does Jesus tell his disciples? If you've ever read the story before, it's a really awesome testimony, awesome story of what Jesus did. But he looks at his disciples. It's like, "We need to feed these people." And the disciples are like, "Well, we don't have anything. How are we going to feed all these 5,000 people? The money we have is not going to cover the cost." It's like, "Well, what do you have?" It's like, "Well, we've got a few fish and a few loaves of bread." And Jesus is like, "Give it to me." And what does he do? He gives thanks. He didn't even say to the Father to multiply the bread and the fish. He just gave thanks. Can I just tell you something? The way of Jesus, of following the great I am, when you feel like it's nothing and it's not enough, always go and err on the side of thanksgiving. Right? Why? Because it opens up your heart to see the glory of God about to be manifested. Thanksgiving is super powerful. An attitude of gratitude. That's another sermon. But here was Jesus multiplying the fish and the bread, and it was a miracle. It was a miracle, an absolute miracle. When was the last time you multiplied some sourdough buns and some tuna? Like, you know, Jesus did that. Maybe not with tuna or sourdough, but he did that. And people were amazed, and everyone ate, and the disciples went, and they fed everybody, and there was 12 baskets left over. And so Jesus, like, bring it, let's not waste it. And they did that. But then Jesus tells the disciples, hey, go on ahead of me, and I'll meet you there. They get on the boat, and they go to the other side, and Jesus goes, and he walks on water. And in verse 20, right after they had said, you know, they're going through the storm, and they see Jesus walking on water, and he says, it is I, or I am. Do not be afraid. So he's beginning to disclose to his disciples a little bit more about his divinity. Jesus was not just a good prophet. Jesus was not just a good teacher. He is the Son of God. Meaning he is deity, not became deity, as Jehovah's Witnesses would say, but rather he was always deity. He was not, the Word became a God. It says the Word was God. Very distinct and very problematic for his hearers. And then he goes the next day to the crowd, and the crowd is looking for Jesus. Why? Because they had seen a miracle. And in John chapter 6, verse 26 to 27, after they had been looking for Jesus, it says in verse 25, when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? Now imagine if Jesus had told them the truth. Like, well, actually, I told my disciples to go on ahead of me, and then I just walked on water and got on the boat, and instantly, miraculously, the boat arrived to the other side. He didn't tell them that, but imagine if he would have. What would they have said? But Jesus goes on, and he gives them a response. And this was happening in the synagogue in Capernaum on a Sabbath. How do we know this? Because if you read a little bit further in John chapter 6, verse 59, it identifies the location and the time of the week and what Jesus was doing. So he's in the synagogue, and they find him there, and he says this, truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has set a seal. Now pause here for a moment. Jesus calls out their motives for looking for him. They're looking for Jesus because they have motives of him becoming their king, of forcing him to become their king so that he can overthrow the Romans and they can have food all the time. They can have their needs met. They're not wanting Jesus because of who Jesus is. They're wanting Jesus for a personal agenda. It's like, Jesus blessed my life. Well, can I tell you the way of Jesus? You can look at Psalms chapter 1, verse 1, or Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, and you can see the way of the blessed life. You want the blessed life? Walk in the ways of God. Submit your life to the ways of God. Not get God to submit to you. He doesn't do that. He doesn't bow to you. The only time Jesus bowed was when he went to the cross. But he didn't even bow to you. He bowed his life before the Father. You can't take this cup from me, but not my will, but yours be done. The Jesus you find in the Bible will not bow to you and your life, your agenda, your goals. If that's the Jesus you're looking for, you might as well go and start a cult. Because that's literally what it is. And a bunch of us, although we're not in a cult, we're living as if we were. Because we want a Jesus that just blesses everything that we want and go even beyond our needs. And yet Jesus is the one who says, if you want life, give it up and follow me. But we want to polish it in North America. We want to polish that because that just looks too crazy. You know the times that Christianity advanced the most into the other parts of the world? Is when people literally went and bought themselves a coffin and put all their possessions in it and say, I'm going to go to this country on the other side of the world to take the gospel there, and I'm going to die there. It's been many generations since we've seen people that are willing to do that. But you know what's happening? God's now sending people from those countries to come to Canada to evangelize the church. People that are willing to give it all up to come to Canada to share the gospel with a community that has overheard the gospel and made it their own way. And I think Jesus is calling us to a true definition of who he really is, the great I am, that bows not to you. He bows to no one, but calls us to bow to him. So he calls out these motives in these people that are looking for him. But then he starts getting into this description of food. The food that endures to eternal life. But then he makes a claim, the Son of Man. Now, as people are listening to this, maybe they didn't fully clue in to what he was saying, but Son of Man is a claim of deity in full humanity. And you can find this claim even mentioned in the book of Daniel. When Daniel has a vision, and he presents in the future about the Son of Man coming to save the world. This is a claim of deity, a claim of Messiah, a claim as the deliverer for God's people of Israel and the world. And then he says, and on him, meaning the Son of Man, meaning Jesus, on him God the Father has set his seal. Think about this. Back in the day when you would get a letter written by someone in high authority, and they would put some wax on the envelope or on the letter, and then they put the seal of their ring on that wax so that you knew who it was coming from. Jesus being the Word, having the seal of the Father on him, saying, this is the one I am sending to you. Are you listening to Jesus? Unfortunately, in John chapter 1, we find that his own people did not recognize him. But Jesus is making a claim here. Hey, the Father's seal is upon me. What does the seal mean? It means ownership and it means guarantee. Meaning God is guaranteeing that Jesus is the real deal. And so Jesus is beginning to build this case. You go on to verse 31 and verse 33 because they begin to mention, our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. See, they were calling out their legacy or their history. And Jesus isn't, dismantling that, but he is revealing something anew to them when he says this, truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave it. Now look at the past tense and then the present active tense. Not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives, not gave, gives you the true bread from heaven. He could have said, my Father gave you bread, and he would have been correct. But he is now trying to open up their eyes to something. He gives you, right now, the present, not just in the past, but in the present, actively. The Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Jesus is the better manna. The manna only lasted temporarily for the day. Most of you are going to start feeling in just a few moments that sense of hunger because we're approaching lunchtime. And so you're already thinking what you're going to have for lunch. Some of you are going to have barbecue. I'm sad you didn't invite me. Some of you are going to go and have pizza. I've had too much of that this week. Thank you, but no thank you. Go and enjoy. God bless you. Unless it's like real authentic Italian, then maybe. Sushi, I'm in. Right? Starting to get hungry, right? But that will only feed you for a moment. Later on, you're going to be hungry again. Tomorrow, you're going to be hungry again. You're going to be hungry every single day. Physical things to meet needs are temporary. They're just in the moment. They do something in the moment, but they do not do what only Jesus can do. And Jesus gives you ultimate satisfaction, eternal satisfaction. Jesus is able to meet the greatest need of your soul, the greatest need of your life, and it is eternal. That when you look at Jesus as the bread of life, your spiritual hunger is fully satisfied in him. Jesus completely satisfies. But they begin to have a problem with this, as usual, right? Verse 35, he says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that have seen me and yet do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never cast out. There's a few things here. A few chapters before, in chapter 4, Jesus has an encounter with the Samaritan woman. And this is significant because Jews did not associate with Samaritans, yet alone a Jewish man associating with a Samaritan woman. He had told the disciples to go into town to go and get some food, and then he strikes up this conversation with a woman that was coming up to get some water at a time when no one else would go, because this woman was shamed by her past sins, and she had been in multiple relationships, had had multiple husbands, and now the man she was with was like her fifth person that she was with. And Jesus points this out, reveals it to her, and she's like, "You must be a prophet, because you know everything about me." And then Jesus says, "If you drink of this water, you'll thirst, but the water I give, you'll never thirst again." And it's like, "Oh, please give me that water." And long story short, this woman realizes that Jesus is the Christ. He makes another claim, "I am He." And she goes into her town and becomes the first evangelist in the Gospels. Go figure. Jesus using a woman from a group of people that were looked down upon by the Jewish people who called themselves the chosen ones. And he uses a woman that had been in multiple relationships, a completely broken life, and she becomes the evangelist that brings an entire town to meet Jesus. And then they say to her, "We no longer believe what this Jesus just because of what you said, but because we heard for ourselves." They too were drinking now of this living water so that they would never thirst again. I love this Jesus that is in the gospel. And he looks at us. When he looks at the people there, they go from being labeled as the crowd to all of a sudden being called the Jews. And John is very intentional about that, because multiple times in his gospel when he mentions the Jews, he's referring to a group of people amongst God's people that were oppositional to Jesus. Right? If you notice in this chapter 6, there was the opposition of not having food, not having sufficiency. Well, Jesus deals with that. There's the opposition of a storm. Well, Jesus deals with that. And then you got this opposition that starts to grow about the skepticism in Jesus, but he still gives his answer. Now, I want you to know something about Jesus that he says here. He calls you to come after him and to believe in him. To come to him and to believe in him. Those are the conditions. You want to experience Jesus meeting and satisfying the needs of your life, you got to come to him. Not go to other things, go to him. And then believe in him. Put your faith in him. Align your life to him. And then he says, "If you, I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe." He's addressing now the Jewish people, right? But then he says this in verse 37. "All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me I will never cast out." I don't know what sort of insecurities you carry in your heart as to why you don't come to God, why you don't draw near to God. And you might think, "Oh, I'm just not worthy, I'm not good enough, I'm not perfect enough, I'm not holy enough." Can I just tell you something? Anyone that walks to Jesus, toward Jesus, he never casts away. He said that. I'd rather trust his words than my emotions or what someone else might think or say. Jesus himself, the great I am, says, "I will never cast anyone away that comes to me." And I think you need to hear that. Because some folks that have heard about Jesus but are still struggling with some sin stuff in their life, or looking at the inadequacies or imperfections of their life, stop going to God, or they walk away from God because they feel unworthy, and yet Jesus says, "When you come to me, I never turn you away." You need to know that. He's trying to address the biggest need in your life. Then you look at the fact that he never casts you away. I already mentioned that. You go to John chapter 6, verse 51, where he says, "I am the living bread that comes down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." And then they begin to label Jesus as some sort of cannibal person, because like, if you eat of this flesh and drink of my blood, you will live forever. It's like, whoa, this is too weird. In another gospel, what you'll find is it was at this point that all these people that were following Jesus, many of them walked away. It says this teaching is too hard to accept. Look, there is a difference between Jesus accepting you and never driving you away. But there's one thing you must understand. Jesus, in John chapter 3, later on, as he's ending his talk with Nicodemus, a religious leader that wanted to follow Jesus in secret, Jesus says this: people don't come out of the dark, or they don't want to be in the light out of fear that what they've done in the dark gets exposed. Jesus, being the light of the world, exposes sin, exposes the truth, but he leads you into eternal life. And he says, "I will give my life for the world." And you need to know this, that Although you might feel like you're not worthy to come to Jesus, Jesus says, come to me. I will never cast you away. I am that manna that came from heaven, and I am here now to meet your every need. But you need to understand, you can't just go into your life and say, Jesus, come and follow me, be in my life. Jesus is saying, you need to come to me and believe in me, and let's go together. I'm going to show you what I'm going to take you into. There needs to be this abandonment to what you want in life. There needs to be this abandonment to what you think Jesus is, and fully embrace what he is revealing himself as. Let me take you to this passage in John chapter 8, verse 12. Because not only does Jesus satisfy all the needs of your life, he is the light of the world. And he makes this claim in John chapter 8, verse 12. He spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. We know that this was said during the Feast of Tabernacles. It was one of the Passover feasts that they had, or one of the celebrations that they had in Jerusalem. They would come there occasionally and have these celebrations. And during this particular celebration, they had this area in the temple court that they would set up with two candle lights or two chandeliers, or whatever you want to call it. Actually, I do know what it's called. During the time of the illumination of the temple, there were these emblems that were to remember the pillar of fire that led the people of Israel by night. So they would set up these two chandeliers, and it would light up the place. And Jesus was looking at that in the temple when they're questioning Jesus about who he is. It was around this time that they brought the woman that had been caught in adultery and threw her in front of Jesus, and they were ready to stone her. And Jesus looked at them and says, he who is without sin cast the first stone. Remember, in chapter 6, he had just said, I will never cast away anyone who comes to me. Remember that. Keep that in mind. In chapter 8, right in the beginning, the first few verses, the first 11 verses, this woman is brought before Jesus. They want to stone her to death because the law of Moses says that they could. And Jesus then said, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. And all these people that were there, from the oldest to the youngest, dropped the stones on the ground and walked away in shame. And then Jesus looks at the woman, and he says to her, where are those who condemn you? It's like, I don't know. He says, well, neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more. See, the Jesus that perhaps some of us want is one that continues to allow you to sin just because he's always going to forgive you. And so the Bible actually says that God's grace is not to be used as a license to sin. Yeah, we all struggle with sin, but we're called out of that to follow Jesus. And Jesus then makes this claim, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, will not stay in darkness, but will have the light of life. And he points to these lights as if, like, you guys remember the pillar of fire? I am that light. That pillar back then, I am. I was there leading the people of Israel through the night and through the day. I am here, but you still don't recognize me. But if you follow me, you will have the light of life. Just like those disciples when they heard that Jesus' teaching was just too difficult because, the eating of his flesh, drinking of his blood, is like, this is so weird. I can't do this. It's too difficult of a teaching. Can I just tell you right now, when the rubber will meet the road, when you begin to find certain things about Jesus that are tough to handle, that's usually when you see people walking away from church or walking away from Jesus, because it's difficult sometimes. Whoever told you that walking with Jesus is just all so full of joy and no challenge, they're not giving you the full picture. The people of Israel had the pillar of fire in front of them by night, and a pillar of cloud by day, and yet they still rebelled against God. So even we're like, well, if I saw fire in front of me and a pillar of fire, I would believe in God. Well, they saw it and they still rebelled. It took the second generation to say, we're not going to be like our fathers and mothers. We will obey God and let's go take over the land. And they were obedient to God, and they followed the leadership of Joshua, who is another representation of what Jesus would come and do. And he leads them into the promised land, and they take over giants. They take over these Jericho and all that sort of stuff, all these militant movements where God does miraculous things. They take over the land. They conquer it. Even Caleb, who is one of the original spies, and he's an old man, he says this, I still feel like a young man, ready to take over. Why? Because he had resolved in his heart he was going to trust and he was going to follow this pillar of fire that leads by night. He was going to trust and obey and align his life to the God who was leading them in such a miraculous way. The disciples did that. They gave everything up to follow Jesus, who claimed to be the light of the world. But then guess what Jesus says to us? In Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 and to 16, Jesus says something in there. He says, you are the light of the world. He's actually saying this to his disciples, because when you look at the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, he's talking to his disciples. The crowds were there listening, but he was addressing his disciples, those who had decided to follow him. And he says, you are the light of the world. A lamp is not put under a basket, but it's to be put out to shine and illuminate the house. A house is set on the hill so that it can shine in the dark. Shine, therefore. I might as well just read this because now I'm starting to make up my own version. Even I can do that, right? You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works, meaning your works of obedience, alignment to Jesus, not just good deeds like anybody can do good things. Canadians are very altruistic. Jesus followers give till it hurts, or give even when it hurts, or serve and do good even when they don't see the immediate results. And when people see this, they will give glory to your Father who is in heaven. You want to win the world for Jesus? The light of the world, the bread of life, Jesus, the great I am, is saying, let me satisfy your life, let me guide your life, and then you go, and now you become the light of the world. Now you shine. It's like Paul, again, echoing his words in these passages when he's saying, I am crucified with Christ. In Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, I am crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I live in this flesh, I live by faith in the one who loved me and gave himself up for me. That is how we follow the light of the world. That is how we live with the sustenance that only the bread of life can give, is by aligning our lives with him. I'm going to ask you to stand with me. I'm going to ask my brother Panache to come up on the keyboard. We're going to do something this morning. I don't know where you're at in your life, but God knows. God knows where you're at. I don't know what you've been running after to satisfy your life, and you always come out feeling empty. You always feel like it's just not enough. Well, listen clearly to what Jesus says. I am the bread of life. You'll never hunger again. You'll never thirst again. He is the living water. As a matter of fact, he told the woman in Samaria that springs of living water will come out of you. Actually, it wasn't to the Samaritan woman. It was in a different passage, also here in the Gospel of John. Or maybe it was to the Samaritan woman. Forget that. Let's focus. Jesus satisfies and Jesus guides. Will you submit your life to the sustenance that only Jesus can give you? Will you submit your life for Jesus to guide you to the full extent? Miracles will break out in your life because of coming to Jesus, believing in Jesus.